Don't fire a shot. I'm John Baxter, sheriff.
Yeah, well, if you're the sheriff, you better get these men on the ground.
Westerns are some of the most iconic movies ever made, with them having been an integral part of cinema since the Great Train Robbery in 1903. They're still incredibly important to the movie world today, with revisionist westerns like Django Unchained and The Power of the Dog receiving immense critical acclaim. It's clear westerns have been insanely important for as long as film has existed as an art form, but there's a type of western that has become arguably more iconic than the standard western: the spaghetti western.
It'll be a lot easier with that.
Now, this is not to say that traditional westerns are bad. You've got to remember that without them, we wouldn't even have the spaghetti western in the first place. And there is absolutely zero doubt that classic American-made westerns have their own merits. However, this video is discussing how the revolutionary spaghetti western ended up receiving the same amount, or sometimes even more, critical acclaim than the American-made ones. Some have even ended up being some of the highest-rated movies of all time. The subgenre has not only directly provided us with some of cinema's greatest moments, but has also indirectly provided us with masterpieces from contemporary filmmakers. So, the real question is, what makes spaghetti westerns so good?
Can you hear this?
I'm sure many of you are already familiar with the subgenre, but for those who aren't, here's a very quick rundown on what a spaghetti western actually is. Strange name, right? Why spaghetti? Well, as funny and stupid as it sounds, the name comes from the fact that these films were produced and directed by Italians. The name was supposedly coined by Spanish journalist Alfonso Sanchez, although I can literally not find anything on this guy online, so it's hard to say if that is actually true. There's a lot of debate over what the first spaghetti western actually is, but it's safe to say that the most famous and successful films of the subgenre are those in the Dollars trilogy, directed by the amazing Sergio Leone and starring the incredibly talented Clint Eastwood. A Fistful of Dollars is arguably the movie that introduced the wider world to the spaghetti western, with it and its two sequels being among the most recognisable westerns of all time. It was also the success of A Fistful of Dollars that paved the way for even more spaghetti westerns to find their footing in the cinematic world. So, as I was saying, what is it about them that makes them so good? Difference. Well, before we get into the more nuanced reasons, we should talk about the sort of umbrella explanation for the incredible quality of spaghetti westerns. That being their difference. Not uniqueness per se, although that is certainly another bonus they have, but the way in which they're different to the traditional American-made western is what makes them so good. While the two genres share the same skeleton, the tweaks that spaghetti westerns made to the original formula is what sets them apart from their American counterparts, and ultimately ended up revolutionising this corner of cinema itself. There's a plethora of examples for this, and I'd like to start with the aesthetics. When talking about the medium of film, it's pretty much imperative to talk about the visuals. While the writing, which we'll get to, is of equal importance, we have to remember that film is a visual-based format. The aesthetics of a spaghetti western are very different to that of an American western. While the American westerns at the time favoured clean aesthetics, with protagonists wearing immaculately clean shirts and hats, often being clean-shaven and having short hair, etc., spaghetti westerns featured characters who were often scruffy and unkempt. Because of this, there's more of a sense of realism in spaghetti westerns, in terms of their looks at least. The antagonists are sometimes better groomed than the protagonists, and there isn't always a clear visual divide between the good guy being attractive and the bad guy being ugly. It's not always as easy to tell who's the protagonist or antagonist from their looks alone, which you could more often than not do in the older American westerns. Equally, towns and their inhabitants are also not necessarily the best looking. with the towns looking dirty and dangerous, and the townsfolk being hairy, filthily dressed gunslingers or saloon goers. And like I said, the actual towns themselves as settings are more grimy and disreputable. The almost picture-perfect golden sands and well-kept wooden buildings are gone, and have been replaced with dingy, run-down structures that reside in barren, unappealing deserts. Sometimes there's even thick, disgusting mud paving the street of these places. You know how a big part of Star Wars' success was because of how different it looked? Instead of utilising the sleek silvers and bright costumes of the sci-fi that came before it, it used more toned-down colours and grimy locations. Plus the protagonists were scruffy, and not in flashy spacesuits like the aforementioned sci-fi before. Well, the exact same thing happened to spaghetti westerns about a decade earlier. The brutality of the Wild West, while certainly exaggerated, was finally being displayed properly through these movies. While definitely stylised in different ways, the spaghetti western got rid of the overly clean and attractive landscapes, people and settings, and replaced them with the brutal reality of living life in the Wild West. In fact, that brings me on to my next point, the brutality and morally grey characters.
When you have to shoot, don't talk.
Another reason as to why spaghetti westerns are so good is because of their willingness to show not only the harsh brutality of the Old West, but also the distinct lack of morality in the majority of characters. Or, in other words, it's their ability to have protagonists that are charming, but sometimes equally as brutal as the antagonists, or simply just out for themselves. Gunfights can be unfair in these movies, either at the hands of the protagonist or the antagonist. A good example is when the man with no name points a rifle at El Indio during the final duel of For a Few Dollars More, or when the titular Django mercilessly guns down his enemies with a machine gun in Django by Sergio Corbucci. Corbucci's films are an excellent demonstration of a spaghetti western's way of displaying the harsh violence that resided in every town in the Wild West. There's the aforementioned example in Django, which also features horrendous brutality at the hands of the film's antagonist, who has Django's hands completely shattered under horse hooves. There's no confusion as to who the bad guy is, of course, but even still, the fact the protagonist is willing to machine gun tens of people down shows how violent the time was. This is also similar to how the man with no name in The Good, the Bad and the Ugly has the highest kill count in the entire film, despite being the supposed, well, good. In Corbucci's 1968 film The Grand Silence, the protagonist's silence shoots the thumbs off of his victims, instead of giving the quick one-shot death like previous Western heroes would have done. Corbucci's and Leone's respective series also feature beatings, which result in quite gory, for the time at least, outcomes. Protagonists and antagonists are beaten relentlessly at times, and blood is drawn, which sounds stupid and tame by nowadays standards, but remember, at the time this was practically unheard of in American-made westerns. This is also same with the shootings that happen in these movies. These feature characters bleeding from their mouths and gunshot wounds in their dying moments, making them incredibly different to the bloodless, immediate deaths of traditional Western characters. There's even a scene in Django where a man has his ear cut off, which is actually so gross and gory, even for the time, that I don't think I'm going to risk showing the clip here on YouTube. But it is out there if you do want to see it. There's no order to the violence or barbarity of the West like there is in other westerns. Protagonists will commit acts as stomach churning as the villains sometimes, and our main characters aren't righteous lawmen or justice bringers. They're cold-blooded killers who, although certainly possess a sense of morality, are ultimately often out for themselves. More often than not, the leads are in pursuit of selfish gain, whether it be through the pursuit of gold or revenge. And along the way, they leave a trail of not only dead antagonists, but also other people who just simply stood in their way. spaghetti western protagonists were ruthless and would draw their gun at the first sight of anyone who could be an obstacle. Characters will also openly betray one another for the sake of their own personal advancement. This can be seen throughout pretty much the entirety of The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, in which all three main characters constantly double-cross each other for the sake of attaining the $200,000 reward at the end of the journey. And this is why I find them so compelling. We don't follow heroes, we follow criminals who are ultimately scumbags when you really think about it. Yet, they're still charismatic and fun to watch because they practically always end up doing the right thing, even if that is only because it aids them in their selfish quest for vengeance or money. And all of this beautiful storytelling, charming yet brutally selfish characters, and extreme violence is backed by another example of why spaghetti westerns are so great: the music. Now, I know talking about copyrighted music in a YouTube video is counterintuitive because I can't play any of it, but to talk about spaghetti westerns without talking about their soundtracks is to basically commit a crime in itself. The scores of these films are exceptional. Loud, grand brass instrumentals are a staple of the franchise, with them backing the swelling climaxes of the famous standoffs that feature so prominently in the subgenre. The trumpet solos solidify the tension, while bouncy electric guitars play over scenes of horse riding or other exciting action pieces to really get you hyped up for what's coming next. However, there is also the use of some strange musical combinations and sounds throughout the soundtracks that result in some amazingly unique pieces, once again straying away from the traditional sounds of the classic western. The best example for this, and probably the best example of any spaghetti western soundtrack, is the score for The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. In the main theme we have a combination of the aforementioned energetic guitars, whistles, chanting and even cannon fire. Then, in the beautiful ecstasy of gold, we're met with wildly lively trumpets which contrast nicely with the epically grand operatic vocals throughout the track. And finally, the song The Trio uses a combination of Spanish flamenco guitar, castanets, and once again, the infamous Mexican-style trumpets to create an epic finale that creates an almost palpable tension. A few other notable examples I'd like to quickly mention is the final duel song in Once Upon a Time in the West. The striking combination of the almost eerie harmonica, dramatic guitar stings, and a powerful string arrangement results in cinema soundtrack gold, and it's an example that I think perfectly cements the legendary status of spaghetti westerns and their music. Then, the opening titles to Django are astoundingly epic and thrust you into the film's action and drama immediately. They were such a powerful inclusion, Quentin Tarantino even used them for the opening of Django Unchained. But it's not just epic sounding grandiosity that makes the music of spaghetti westerns so good. It's also the more somber, quieter scores that make them so enjoyable. There are plenty of examples throughout the Dollars trilogy, however, I'd like to get away from those movies for a second, as there's a piece of music in another spaghetti western which I think highlights this point perfectly. The piece in question is titled The Grand Duel, Parts Prima, and it is a hauntingly beautiful piece. It's a slow piece that almost evokes mystery with its harmonica and almost airy strings. It's great, like all the other pieces I mentioned. Each musical score complements the scene it features in perfectly, making spaghetti westerns as amazing as they are. To be able to have the music flawlessly convey the same emotions as what's actually happening on screen is a skill which I feel wasn't always present in American westerns at the time. Each film's soundtrack can make you excited, tense, or even quite sort of melancholy with ease, and does so with the use of these unconventional musical combinations. Once again, another factor of filmmaking is executed so magnificently in this subgenre, demonstrating exactly why it's heralded as one of the best and most influential subgenres of all time. Originally, I was going to end this video by summing up my thoughts on why spaghetti westerns are so good, but I think there's an aspect of them that shows just how good they are, which we haven't spoken about yet. and that's their effect on cinema as a whole. Because they're not just great themselves, but are also great in how they managed to spawn some great movies after they themselves were long gone. The biggest example of this is how the spaghetti western actually changed westerns as a whole. All of the violence, disreputable protagonists, etc. eventually found its way into the more mainstream American-made westerns that followed. These components could particularly be found in Clint Eastwood's post-Leone westerns, such as High Plains Drifter, which sees his character wreak as much revenge on the townsfolk as he does the outlaws. In fact, the magnitude of influence spaghetti westerns have had on cinema goes beyond the films that followed shortly after, as we can see their influence still affecting cinema to this day. Most notably, as I mentioned before, in the work of Quentin Tarantino. Both of his westerns, Django Unchained and The Hateful Eight, take a lot of elements from spaghetti westerns, and I mean a lot. Not only does Django Unchained partially share the name with Corbucci's 1966 release, it also utilises the music from two spaghetti westerns, one being Django of course, and the other being Trinity Titoli, which features in the comedy spaghetti western They Call Me Trinity. The same can be said for The Hateful Eight, with its snowed-in environment being taken directly from The Great Silence. So, spaghetti westerns may technically be dead and gone in their purest form, but the quality they possess has resulted in their spirits living on through contemporary filmmakers, meaning they will always be a substantial part of cinema history. And that is why spaghetti westerns are so good.